even in the realm of IBS, right? We've had sort of the Rome Foundation that's sort of set this criteria. We've called this functional GI disorders, and that actually has changed, renamed functional GI disorders to be disorders of gut-brain interaction. And I think that's so powerful because it truly highlights this understanding of what we now know. When we look at irritable bowel syndrome, we're seeing this imbalance, or a term called dysbiosis, an imbalance between your friendly bacteria. And we're seeing a breakdown in that security perimeter. Your fence posts are being knocked out, where pathogens, inflammatory compounds, toxins can now get into and translocate across that barrier, getting into systemic circulation, and that starts to activate your immune system. 70% of our immune system is contained within the GI tract. This is where even some of the biggest microbiome researchers have found, like, the statistic is something like, less than 7% of Americans actually consume the recommended amounts of fiber. I mean, we have, going back to kind of your idea or your question around neuroinflammation, we have psychobiotics now. Psychobiotics are probiotics that have specific benefits or exert specific benefits to our mental well-being, meaning they're targeted in precision to decreasing inflammation in the brain.
Hey there. Before we dive in, I wanted to say thank you so much for listening. You know, we created BioBelly because gut health changed everything for me and the people I love. I watched my best friend Ankit battle ulcerative colitis and my aunt battle IBS-C, so irritable bowel syndrome with a predominance of constipation. And seeing their journey, I realized how broken the system truly was. Because there is a huge information gap between how our body works, what are the root issues, root causes of our gut health issues, and what that means in terms of the course of action to take to get on a fast track towards long-term health and wellness. Because we have such a big information gap, there is this over-reliance on short-term fixes that really never get us to the solution we truly deserve, which is good health for the long term. And that's exactly why the BioBelly Show exists. It serves to have conversations with medical professionals from all schools of medicine, whether it's gastroenterologists to IBS dietitians to gut hypnotherapists to CBT experts, which are cognitive behavioral therapists. And the goal is to learn from them and understand what the root causes can be, and hopefully that will tell us exactly how it is we can take great strides towards our long-term wellness. So if these conversations do give you value, we would really love it if you would hit the subscribe or like the video or even comment, because it shows us that what we're doing here is really solving that problem, which is filling that information gap and hopefully providing us the information we need and the support we need to long-term health and wellness. So without further ado, let's hop into our episode. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to a fresh new conversation of the BioBelly Show. Today we're joined by Kara Siedman, a registered dietitian and microbiome expert with more than 14 years of clinical experience. Kara has worked with patients across all walks of life, from those struggling with IBS and SIBO to people navigating complex gut issues that affect their whole body. What makes Kara's work so powerful is her ability to take cutting edge microbiome science and translate it into practical, personalized strategies that actually work in real life. She's passionate about uncovering the root causes behind digestive symptoms and using food, lifestyle, and culture as tools to restore balance and health. I am personally super excited for this conversation where we're going to explore Kara's framework for finding the root cause of gut issues, how she personalizes food recommendations, and why culture and individuality are so important in healing the gut. Kara, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
Kara, quickly, I actually just wanted to learn because your story is so fascinating. We were talking about it a little bit earlier. What led you into dietetics and eventually into this huge world of microbiome science?
So it's funny because sometimes I think back to, like, when I was entering to college, what are you going to do with your life? And it made most sense that I was going down the route of medicine. I have a lot of physicians and medical practitioners in my family. And so as I started school and kind of delving into what am I going to do, I realized though very early on that I didn't like to touch people. And and I always was someone who was very much uh drawn to natural medicine, to diet. I went through changes in my own diet as a vegetarian and so that sort of led me into this world of dietetics. It was my brother who was like, "Hey, you can study nutrition." I was like, "What does that even mean?" And I got into it and fell in love with it. And during that time, I actually really got into fermentation. And experimenting with fermenting, I got introduced to kind of this old school nutrition enzyme therapy, and it was all about sprouting and fermenting to make your food, more digestible, but also to increase bioavailability. And so I started experimenting super early on with making kombucha and sauerkraut and seed cheeses and sprouting everything. My college apartment was like, a science experiment. So I think kind of innately in me, I was already getting into this sort of microbial world. And this was really not to kind of give my age away, but this was kind of before the Human Microbiome Project even really launched. And so that wasn't part of my study. It wasn't part of my education, but the world of nutrition was, and I just fell in love with it. And as I moved through my education and my internship, I just loved how nutrition was so important in the overall sort of health landscape. And that led me working in various demographics, came through very conventionally, worked in the hospital and ICU and different floors, but found myself in outpatient counseling and really wanting to change people's behaviors, give people the tools to really ultimately curate their own lives and their own nutrition and really to benefit their own health. And so that led me into various demographics, working in diabetes. And then I landed in actually in gastroenterology, where I got in touch with these GI doctors here in Colorado that were interested in bringing nutrition into their clinic. I don't think they really understood what that meant. And so here comes, young Kara, who's like, "Hey, we can create this program." This was as I was starting to get into integrative functional medicine at this point, and built a thriving practice within an allopathic GI care. And so it was a really beautiful relationship. Not the norm. Most GI offices don't have dietitians available, but really built a beautiful practice that people went in, they got scoped. I used to say the doctor is structurally, biochemically, they can see what's going on, but then we work with the world within. And that just kind of, catapulted my love of not just the GI tract and helping people feel better, but really this world within our microbial world. And that kind of catapulted my career into working with patients for over, 10 years in that realm, and then moved into the microbiome space, working for various companies, working with researchers who are truly at the innovative front of finding these microbes and better understanding what they're doing. And so it's been really fun, and it's amazing to see what's changed and grown over the course of the last 10 years, and I'm excited to see what the next 10 years brings.
Awesome, awesome. Now, I'm just gonna backtrack a little bit. In that time when you were in that messy room, when you were sprouting and you were fermenting different types of foods and seeing what's gonna happen, was there a moment you realized food could be as powerful as medicine for gut health?
I think that's something that deep down was always something I believed. Now my feelings around it has actually changed because especially working with chronic patients, I think there's so much that diet can do, but I also don't think diet is the only thing that's part of, because we live in this sort of modern world and we're not really built for this modern world. And so I think diet's important. I think nutrition and what we eat and how we eat is truly the biggest modifier and truly the biggest modulator of the gut and our health. But I personally, at this point in time, I don't believe that we can really just be healthy and have, all of our health taken care of through our nutrition. I think there are so many things that are missing in our diet that, depending on where you live and our seasons and our agricultural, like all of that impacting our nutritional quality. But I think if you don't take care of your diet and you don't pay attention to your diet, you don't improve the quality of your diet, then unfortunately we're really at, increased risk. So I think I've always believed nutrition is the most important thing, and I still do. If someone was to ask me, what's the number one thing you can do for your diet? I don't think it's a supplement. I think it is the diet, or for your health, I should say. I don't think it's a supplement, but I do think it's the diet. But we do have to sort of blend these worlds together now because our modern society, unfortunately, isn't built for us to be able to get everything we need from the diet.
Absolutely, absolutely. And speaking of increased risk because of this impacting our ability to absorb just nutrients, this modern world, you've been helping IBS and SIBO patients for over a decade, for 9 years, we mentioned. What are the biggest misconceptions people have about these conditions?
That's a great question, and I think we're constantly learning
Yeah.
more. I mean, even in the realm of IBS, right? We've had sort of the Rome Foundation that's sort of set this criteria. We've called this functional GI disorders, and that actually has changed, renamed functional GI disorders to be disorders of gut-brain interaction. And I think that's so powerful because it truly highlights this understanding of what we now know, which is that our microbiome is our foundation. And that's what I'm so excited about, is that there's not one study out there now that any chronic disease that we have not started to link back to the health and resiliency of the microbiome. And that's something. I work for a company now. We've coined this term called the gut X axis, which is basically this understanding of that bidirectional communication that exists between the gut, the microbiome, and our other organ systems of the body. And I think of the microbiome now as that third part of the stool, and that third leg of the stool, where genetics, environment are playing a huge role. That's not the only piece. And so I truly view the microbiome as that. And I think it's an exciting world we're living in. But one of the things that I've noticed, and especially, bringing it back to kind of the nutrition space, is that we can take care of our IBS or our SIBO with diet alone. And that's just not true. And in both realms, like, we see that people aren't consuming enough of these nutritionally dense foods, high fiber foods, which we know are so important to feed our microbes. But we also think that if we take out certain foods, that we're getting to the root. And that's where I've seen a lot of misconception, is that, oh, we can follow certain diets and heal or build resiliency. And unfortunately, diet is really there to manage symptoms. So I think that's one of the areas that I've definitely learned over the years, is we can use dietary uh, elimination diets. There's so many out
Mhm.
there that can be really successful in managing symptoms, but they're not getting down to the root. And the root is what's happening in the microbiome, as evidenced by this new name of functional GI disorders like irritable bowel syndrome being called disorders of gut brain interaction.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And yeah, specifically IBS, I feel like, yeah, that we are learning more and more. It's just like awareness is spreading around this the gut brain axis, where major treatments for IBS is things like gut hypnotherapy, where
Oh, yeah.
right, where you're seeing even like specific like gadgets, or just like things that stimulate the vagus nerve
Nerve.
somehow can,
Mhm.
cause that calming effect, and thereby lessen the symptoms. If you could explain for our viewers, like, what IBS is in terms of what are reasons it's caused on the scientific level, because of course, yeah, I get that stress is causing, tummy issues, but then if we can go a level deeper than that, I would really appreciate
Yeah, I think, we're still
it.
learning
Mhm.
more. A lot of the earlier studies done in IBS looked primarily at the colon. There's been some newer research coming out looking at actually what's happening in the small intestine, which is, our immune site. And so when we say that this is a disorder of gut brain interaction, just to kind of bring it back a little bit, we understand that the gut communicates to our brain and the brain communicates to our gut. It's a majority of the signaling is actually happening from gut to brain. I mean, we know that a lot of the signaling is happening. But to really kind of bring it to very sort of simple terms, when we look at what's happening within the gut, both in the small intestine and large intestine, we've got this world of microbes. And we know that when we speak of our commensal organisms, we've got our really good bugs, those probiotic species that have a lot of different benefits in the body, with other bugs, some pathogenic, unfriendly bacteria, or just our commensal species. So those that live there in harmony, but as they increase in abundance, they can become opportunistic at times, right? And so there's this kind of beautiful balance, just like a rainforest, right? Where everything's kind of feeding off of one another and everyone's moving in harmony. But because of this sort of modern world, or because of what I like to call these microbiome disruptors, which is everything from our diet, right? Our chronic stress, certain medications, antibiotics. I mean, I don't think anyone's arguing at this point the impact that antibiotics have on the gut. that all these things that come in, our environmental factors, they start to disrupt this delicate balance where we start to decrease the amount of friendly bacteria or probiotic species, and we increase in these opportunist or potential pathogens. And that starts to disrupt then the balance within. We start to decrease some of those security measures, one of that being our mucosal barrier, which is like our security perimeter, or our fence. I always look outside my window because I see my fence out there, my dog running around. I don't want him to get out of the fence from getting into our immune system. So this is a semi-porous barrier where water and nutrients can get through, but we need to keep out those larger molecules and things that could disrupt or drive inflammation to the rest of the body. And so when we look at irritable bowel syndrome, we're seeing this imbalance, or a term called dysbiosis, an imbalance between your friendly bacteria. And we're seeing a breakdown in that security perimeter. Your fence posts are being knocked out, where pathogens, inflammatory compounds, toxins can now get into and translocate across that barrier, getting into systemic circulation. And that starts to activate your immune system. 70% of our immune system is contained within the GI tract. So we start to activate all these different immune pathways and immune cells, and that's what triggers inflammation. And that inflammation is not just contained in the gut. And that's what's been really exciting about in the microbiome space, is that this gut x-axis, that now those inflammatory signals and inflammatory compounds can ultimately go to every part of the body, the brain included. And so when we think about irritable bowel syndrome, where these certain compounds, and many of us have heard of some of these, like lipopolysaccharides, which are inflammatory compounds that are on some of our bacteria, that this can cross the blood-brain barrier and start to activate those immune cells in your brain and trigger neuroinflammation, which is why disruptance or imbalance or dysfunction in your gut is really a primer and a driver of disruptions and dysfunction in the brain, or inflammation in the brain. So a big player in sort of chronic anxiety and depression. So this is really happening at that microscopic level, and there's a lot of steps we can do and a lot of things we can do to help decrease that interaction. But then the opposite. So I have, a lot of patients of mine that are like, well, I never had, the level of anxiety that I have now before my GI symptoms set place. So that's kind of understanding this gut to brain. But then we have people who, like when we get really nervous and we have to go to the bathroom, right? Like we all feel that. So then we know that there are signals that are happening from brain to gut, and this activates different pathways, our HPA axis, which is that negative feedback system that basically tells our body to chill out. So when we have chronic stress is essentially a maladaptive process that keeps your body in an acute stress phase, acute stress being something that happens immediately and then we bounce right back. But when we have chronic stress, it sort of keeps your body in that vicious cycle where we get excessive production of cortisol, which is our stress hormone. And having too much cortisol creates imbalance in the gut. So, too much cortisol creates dysbiosis. This starts to weaken the vagus nerve, that super highway. You mentioned that there are, instruments out there, but your vagus nerve is essentially that highway that connects gut to brain. And so when we have dysbiosis or this imbalance, it starts to weaken that. I think of it as like placing boulders on that highway where now you can't drive through. You've got to go a completely separate path to try to send those helpful signals to the brain. And so when we're in this sort of chronic stress stage or phase, it basically shuts down that process. And so your body stays in this acute stress. So you're constantly pumping out all this cortisol. And then that disrupts a lot of processes that go on in the brain to help decrease inflammation. So we know this communication is
Yeah.
happening in both directions. And ultimately, one of the things that's so important is if we can maintain the health of our microbiome by having those probiotic species there, those health promoting species, those that are producing short chain fatty acids, that you're then feeding those species correctly, that you can produce those anti-inflammatory compounds to then travel to these parts of the body and start working their benefits.
Gotcha, gotcha. And in your 9 years of experience, and even now, when you have these clients coming up to you saying, "Hey, Kara, I have IBS," when you look across your patients, are there any like symptoms or food reaction patterns that you see most often?
Yeah, I mean, IBS, I think, varies, and I it's always one of those interesting conditions that people are very upset to learn about because, it's kind of like think about it from like a psychological standpoint. Like you've been suffering, struggling every day, not feeling well, and then you go to the doctor and you're told that, oh, there's nothing wrong with you. Where this is a really interesting subgroup of people that actually wish they had a diagnosis, which to me is like so crazy to think about because we don't but they want an answer to what's happening because they feel so bad, and this was definitely, an area of conversation that I had a lot with the providers and the doctors that I worked with is that, we used to say, like, this was used all the time, "Oh, it's just in their head." I mean, it's not wrong because what's happening in their head is impacting their gut, but this is an actual condition, and it's rooted in imbalance in the microbiome, so we see everything from chronic bloating to constipation and diarrhea to even reflux or, stomach pain and cramping. I mean, the symptoms do vary, alternating constipation, diarrhea, and of course, there are other things and factors that play a role in those symptoms, but after we've ruled out a lot of
Mhm.
imbalances or lack of production of certain enzymes or gallbladder issues, that again, it's rooted in this dysfunction in the microbiome. And so oftentimes, GI symptoms are that first sign that something's not in balance, but IBS symptoms, even, irritable bowel syndrome, we have a lot of people that are experiencing symptoms outside of the gut as well. And that's because we know the gut's connected to just about every system. So I would say bloating is a really big one, especially bloating
Mhm.
that gets worse as the day goes on. So oftentimes an accumulative effect. And then generally from bowel habits, it's a gamut between constipation, diarrhea, or alternating. And I would say those are kind of the top complaints when it comes to irritable bowel syndrome. And when it comes to the diet, there's a lot of dietary triggers. And so a lot of patients will come to me and say, I'm allergic or I'm sensitive to these foods. It's not an allergy, but food sensitivity or loss of oral tolerance, meaning your immune system is not able to determine what's friend or foe because we know our immune system is contained in the GI tract. That's often what drives food sensitivities. And so we know there are certain types of foods, FODMAPs, for example, fermentable carbohydrates that are really your most new, I would say your most beneficial foods. These are the foods that feed your friendly bacteria, but because of their fermentable nature, they create gas. And depending on the amount of bacteria that's potentially, like in SIBO, where it's in your small intestine where it shouldn't be, or overgrowth of certain pathogenic bacteria, then we can create excessive amounts of these
Mm.
gases. And so a lot of times when we remove those foods from the diet, we take out the food that's feeding that bacteria. And so we get definitely relief in our symptoms. But there's been plenty of research done on the longevity of the FODMAP diet. And in fact, if we follow it for more than 3 months, we actually decrease diversity and we start to decrease resiliency. And it's actually a driver for dysbiosis, which is why it's so important to work with practitioners. I've had patients come to me that have been following low FODMAP diet for 5 years, which is insane. I mean, and I've done microbiome testing on them and they have such poor diversity. We're not producing, the amount of short chain fatty acids because you're essentially starving your bacteria. All your good bugs are essentially there on life support saying, feed
Right, right.
me. So I will often use low FODMAP diet depending on my client or my patient as just kind of a bridge to help reduce symptoms while we utilize interventions to really build resiliency and start to improve the health of the microbiome.
Gotcha. And when you were mentioning the microbiome testing, and I'm sorry if I'm looking down, I'm actually taking notes. I'm learning a lot. But when you were mentioning the microbiome testing and the gallbladder testing in the beginning, like of course just to rule things out. If we can deep into that, if we can dive deep into that just a bit, when someone does come to you with chronic issues, or not chronic, but just IBS issues, what's your framework for uncovering the root cause?
Yeah. It's a great question, and something that I actually have trained a lot of dietitians on and especially working within a GI office because symptoms of gas, bloating, diarrhea, constipation, there's a lot of differential diagnoses out there. Which is why people go through a lot of workup to ultimately get the diagnosis or the term irritable bowel syndrome, which is very disheartening, like as I mentioned, for patients and clients to hear. It's a good thing, right? It's not, inflammatory bowel disease like ulcerative colitis or Crohn's. It's not cancer, it's not something else. But Structurally, those are some of the things that, of course, get ruled out. So we had patients that obviously went through scoping. They would get their colonoscopy or endoscopy to just rule out whether it was, H. pylori or, like I mentioned,
Right.
IBD or something
Mhm.
structurally or biochemically happening. Now, beyond that, oftentimes then, I patients would come to me, and that's where we start to look through some of these other differential diagnoses that could be related to, say, gallbladder. So, whether they went in for ultrasound to look if there's gallstones. Because again, GI symptoms, you feel it everywhere, right? From your bowels to reflux to pain, and it's a close area. So sometimes it's really hard to discern, like, well, is this your small intestine? And so we kind of work through, well, what are the things happening? Now, of course, like when you feel your symptoms is a very important tell because it can definitely
Right.
correlate to the part of digestion that we're in. So if someone has symptoms, let's say within the first 30 minutes of eating, well, food is in your stomach. So what's happening in your stomach? Well, we have stomach acid to break down proteins, right?
Yes.
We have motility. So if someone's vomiting, let's say within 30 minutes of eating, well, then I'm thinking about, well, maybe we're not digesting food at the rate we should. And that's a term called, say, gastroparesis. So when I work with patients, I'm asking very detailed questions as to, well, when do you experience your bloating? Is this something that's happening within 30 minutes to a couple hours after eating? Or is this something you mostly notice towards the end of the day? Which would mean that it's as things are getting into your large intestine and they're starting to get fermented by your bacteria, which is ultimately going to be an IBS or SIBO situation. Um, so I think that's a really important part of the conversation when we're working with people with digestive distress. Within 1 to 2 hours after eating, if we get a lot of bloating, I think of digestive enzyme production. So, your small intestines, that's where we produce all of those important enzymes that further break down your carbohydrates, your proteins, and your fats into those basic molecules. And so, if we're not producing, let's say, enough lipase from the pancreas, then we would often notice symptoms happening, closer to that eating time versus it being, something that's just concentrated towards the
Right.
end of the day. So, I would take people through a lot of those conversations if I felt like, oh, maybe there is an actual enzyme deficiency, then we would look at things like pancreatic elastase. I would do sucrose breath testing to look at disaccharide, so different types of carbohydrate breakdown. Are we lacking those enzymes? And then, of course, as people experience symptoms later in the day, bowel changes, that's when we start to think of like, okay, well, irritable bowel syndrome, SIBO, could that be at play? So I think that's so important is if we're someone who's suffering from GI issues to really check in with yourself too and say, when do I notice? Like if we wake up in like a lot of IBS patients will say, I wake up feeling
Yeah.
amazing. And then as I eat and as the day goes on, I just progressively get worse. That's very common. Whereas if someone wakes up with a ton of bloating, well, then I'm thinking about stool burden. I'm thinking about, well, what happened the night before? Again, is this a motility issue? Is this, say, pelvic floor dysfunction, which is considered a functional condition where we just aren't ever emptying completely? So I think the GI, that's what is so fun about the GI space is there's a lot of diagnoses or conditions and the symptoms all
Yeah.
overlap.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think that's why it's so hard to really just, I guess, like, in a care standpoint, like, a personalized care for a person suffering from IBS at scale. Like, you really need a person one-on-one taking you through these steps of diagnosis, asking you questions of, "When do you feel bloated? When do these issues arise?" So you can understand exactly where that problem could be rooted, and from there, get them a course of action.
The other side of it too is IBS, because it's rooted in microbiome dysfunction, is also secondary and or co-occurring with autoimmune conditions and, again, chronic stress or other sort of psychosocial conditions. And so it's oftentimes not singular on its own. And we know that even SIBO, right, is generally a cause. Like I'm blanking right now on the percentage of IBS patients that actually have SIBO, but usually it can be triggered by, say, a bout of food poisoning, right? And SIBO often co-occurs with other autoimmune conditions. And so I do think it's important to work with someone who's knowledgeable because we do want to approach each IBS patient or each GI patient individually because the other thing we risk is and I've definitely have had this happen where if we start with just extreme dietary elimination, people get very fearful to add food back in. So if I can avoid taking foods out of the diet sometimes, to me, that's always a better route because instead I'm working on, well, instead of this, can we swap with this? Because we do want to keep our diet as diverse and varied as possible. And I would say that is something that I see as kind of one of the hardest barriers is that we often go too restricted and there is this innate fear. And that fear then also drives microbial dysfunction and disruption. And so it's like this vicious cycle. And so I'm very cautious on how I use dietary intervention. And oftentimes I'm trying to get people to eat more, especially include more of those prebiotic, those fiber based foods, because we know that's truly what's most helpful for the microbiome.
Gotcha, gotcha. And speaking of fiber-based foods, I wanted to go on a tangent, but you mentioned fiber, so I want to ask this one. As a dietitian, what's your framework for prescribing foods for someone with gut issues? Like, where do you usually start?
It's a great question. I don't know if I even I have to think
Uh,
about it. I don't know if I ever have a starting
I,
point.
everyone's starting point's
So
different,
often
right?
well, it is, and oftentimes, I mean, for any practitioner out there listening or for any patient, generally what I do is I will have people generally take me through a typical
Okay.
day because I do wanna get a sense of what are our most common foods because sometimes we can do modified or, more selective elimination where maybe we just take out one type of food because it's so predominant in the diet. But one of the things with fiber, and I think this is, I was just talking to someone who I work with about this term that's become popular in social media, which is fiber
Oh,
maxing.
yes.
Um, I,
Big fan.
I laugh because as a dietitian and all of us dietitians, like we've never not talked about fiber. Fiber always been the topic of conversation. We just didn't like create this like catchy, name for
Mhm.
it. But I think one of the things we've come to learn, and this is where even some of the biggest microbiome researchers have found like the statistic is something like, less than 7% of Americans actually consume the recommended amounts of fiber. This is something that research has really honed in on when we look at blood sugar regulation, cardiovascular health. I mean, you name it, fiber supports. And our diet is just getting less and less fiber rich because we know that more than 70% of our foods are considered ultra processed foods. Ultra processed foods being those that are stripped of a lot of nutrients, that have a lot of emulsifiers and preservatives added to it, that we know are part of sort of this health epidemic of definitely, promoting more health risk and also creating more damage to the microbiome. And so that's something I look at right away is like in someone's diet, like what percentage of our diet is more processed, where we don't have those fiber containing foods. Because the other side of the coin is if we are consuming less than that 10 to 15 grams of fiber per day, which are recommended amounts of fiber are anywhere from, you know, 25 to even 40, right? And there have been studies now looking at 50 grams of fiber for really preventing colon cancer, which is the leading cause of cancer in younger adults now. 50 grams of fiber is a lot. Think of how many people are following low carb diets, paleo diets, keto diets, right? We've just moved so far away from these plant-based and plant-rich foods that it's not shocking to think that less than 7% of Americans are actually consuming the recommended amounts of fiber. But we have to be careful when we add fiber in. It's kind of a twofold
Okay.
approach. If we have a lot of dysbiosis, meaning we don't have those beneficial bacteria like your bifidobacteria, which are needed to they're known as primary degraders, bifidobacteria, your ruminococcus species. These are those initial species that are there to break those fibers down so that your secondary degraders can then create short chain fatty acids. And so if you're missing those initial primary degraders, then when you start to add a lot of fiber in, those bugs aren't there and you can see more bloating, you can see more gas. And so sometimes when people come to me and say, my body doesn't like fiber, my body's not made to digest it. Well, none of our bodies are, right? It's actually the bugs that digest it and break it down and ferment it. But we also know that fiber is bulking. And so if we go too hard, too fast, then that can create fiber. So there's a tolerance buildup, meaning slowly adding it in so we can slowly start to feed those beneficial bacteria, but we're not adding so much bulk at once. And so I'll have people sort of incrementally increase their fibers. And then we also want to make sure you're consuming enough hydration and water because fiber pulls, right? Especially your soluble fiber, it pulls water into your colon. And so if you're not adding that water back in, then it can be a little too bulking and create more constipation. So I think, especially in light of this sort of fiber maxing, we just need to be smart about how we're doing it. And just because you have a GI side effect. And beans are a really good example of
Right.
that. People start, think about how we eat beans. Most of us are not eating it daily. And then all of a sudden we sit down and eat a
Yeah.
huge bowl of chili,
Yeah.
right? Um, and then, yeah, so you're adding a whole lot of soluble fiber, a whole lot of prebiotic fiber. And if you have that dysbiosis, then yes, you're potentially going to have more bloating. And if you've, added all that bulk, you're potentially going to slow motility too much, add more bloating without adding that water in. So there's steps that I'll take to incrementally build up that tolerance to fiber. And of course, there's ways to make fiber more
Mhm.
digestible. There's definitely higher fiber foods that are less fermentable, that contain lots of great prebiotics, but don't have that same, fermentation or same fermentability and fermentable nature in the body. And so sometimes I'll emphasize those initially before adding in the onions and the garlic and the beans and the cauliflower and all these things that we know can create a little bit more GI distress.
Gotcha, gotcha. And you were mentioning a bit about ruminococcus and bifidobacterium. I
Mhm.
was curious, like, there is another test that sometimes people do as a diagnostics tool, which is the GI map. I was wondering if that's something ever you used with a patient, and maybe given the bacterial concentrations, like the amount of specific bacterial strains, if that was a source of insights as to what could be the root cause or what could be the issue.
Yeah, I mean, I love stool testing. I think, I've been in this space for a while and I, transparently have worked for stool testing companies. And so I think there's an art and
Right.
science to utilizing stool tests to gain valuable clinical insight.
Mhm.
Now, one thing I will mention, we can't diagnose based on microbes. But what we do know from the research is there are certain patterns or signatures or consortiums that are common in certain conditions. And so irritable bowel syndrome, we see certain patterns. SIBO, we see certain patterns. And of course, it's not diagnostic, but it can give you that insight. And so I've used GI map, I've used some other stool testing. There's some varying technologies out there. I definitely, think there's benefits to all of them. And I challenge people to make sure that they get really good education from the companies because again, there's nuances to seeing this. So if all of a sudden I'll do if any type of stool testing, right? Whether it's whole genome sequencing where you get both taxonomy, who is in the microbiome, as well as the functions,
Wow.
because you can have microbes there that aren't doing what they're supposed to do. And maybe it's because you're not feeding them. Maybe it's because we're not digesting our food sufficiently, and that's impacting then down below in how our bacteria then ferment. So you can get a lot of insight in stool testing on how the diet that you're consuming, how that diet's working for your bugs. You can get an idea of a digestive capacity. Maybe we're not breaking down, let's say, for example, a good example of that is protein. Protein is something that, of course, we start to break down in our stomach and then furthermore in your small intestine. So if you don't have sufficient hydrochloric acid, if you don't have sufficient proteases, then you have larger protein molecules that can get into the microbiome and start getting fermented by your bugs. And if you've got a lot of that dysbiotic bacteria, unfriendly bacteria, then they can actually ferment those proteins and create compounds and gases that are more harmful for our
Oh.
health, ammonia, hydrogen sulfide. So, P-cresol, things like that, that if I see really elevated amounts of those functions, of those proteolytic byproducts, protein byproducts, then either that's someone who's consuming so much protein, that larger amount, or they're not adequately digesting it. So I think stool testing, especially as you get into some, deeper understanding of how the microbiome works, can really give valuable insight into your clinical course of action. Another way I like to use stool testing is if, like, I use the analogy of like a desert, right? We want our microbiome to be like a
Right.
rainforest where you've got all these different species there. It's robust, it's resilient, it's thriving, it's beautiful, right? But if I look at someone's microbiome and they have really poor diversity, they've got lots of pathogenic, they don't have a lot of their beneficial species there, and let's say they are someone that presents with SIBO or has pathogen, I might not go after them with antimicrobials because then I'm keeping a desert a desert. And is that what's continuing to drive this decreased resiliency and some of the issues where maybe we need to do some support in adding in certain components to help naturally, sort of recalibrate that balance before going in with antimicrobials. So I think sometimes stool testing can be really valuable when used correctly because what it doesn't do, and this is some of the more traditional medical methodology of, like, I call it point and shoot. like kill that and reseed that. And that's just not how it works. When we take probiotics, when we add beneficial bacteria in, you're doing or you're adding those probiotics in to get targeted benefits. It's very hard to colonize and to increase the growth or abundance of those beneficial bacteria. We don't know yet in the research why someone can take certain probiotic species and start to build and colonize and reseed versus why someone can't. We don't understand that. What makes a responder versus non responder? We know the microbiome is part of that. We also know that diet's a big part of it, but we don't really have and I think we'll get there eventually to understand that. But it's not as simple as take this probiotic and you'll now have that abundance. We're taking probiotics to get the targeted benefits. And that is truly where the future is going. And that's really one of the reasons why I'm excited to work in the company I am now, because we're doing these more precision based probiotics or postbiotics or prebiotics so that we have now the understanding and technology to know exactly what they're doing. And I think that's a kind of paradigm shift in not just stool testing, but in our understanding of the microbiome and how we use these microbiome therapeutics to benefit the health of the microbiome. And so I think, because it's a very kind of traditional medical model of like, you have this, kill this, take this medication. And it's just more nuanced. It's not as simple.
I am so, so excited, especially about those customized, like targeted therapeutics. I'm so, so excited. I wanted to ask a bit of a more fun question. When you were referring to autoimmune conditions and also way back in our first question, neuroinflammation, it almost prompted me to think about how our gut and that leaky gut, which you were talking about, that permeable, that broken fence, as you mentioned, how that's causing these inflammatory signals all throughout our body, causing issues in even different organs of our body. I just found that really cool. I didn't have like a question behind it, but but I would
Yeah.
love your thoughts. Like, is there
Yep.
is like that connection? Are we learning more and more about how issues like because neuroinflammation? When I think of my brain, I think of Parkinson's. I think of depression. Have we seen like issues that increased correlation between our gut and issues of the brain or of other organs?
Absolutely. And in fact, I don't think there's really a chronic condition out there that actually hasn't been linked back to what's happening or what's going on in the
Oh,
microbiome. And I think that's why the microbiome is such an exciting area especially as a practitioner, because it gives you a foundational support. So I mean, one of the analogies that I like to use is think of a home, right? Like let's say you're shopping for a home and you find your most perfect house. It's got everything you've ever wanted. It's exactly where you want it to be. What's the thing that we wait for is that inspection report to make sure our foundation is secure, because if it comes back showing that your foundation has cracks in it, then your house, your stability and resilience of your house is at risk, right? So that hurricane that comes or if that tornado comes, we're potentially at risk. That is the microbiome. So if we have cracks in our foundation, if we have a loss of these beneficial species, if we've got a broken down fence, then our body is not as resilient. And that's this gut X axis. And so we even have research now. One of the areas that the founder of my company, Resbiotic, has been doing a lot of research in is the lung microbiome and the relationship between gut and lung. And in fact, the lung wasn't even included in the Human Microbiome Project because we used to think the lung was sterile. We don't really have any sterile parts of the body, with the exception of actually that mucosal barrier. We have eye microbiomes. We have a unique brain microbiome that they're discovering now. So these sort of unique balances, and we know that the communication that's happening from gut to these systems is disrupting that balance. But we also know that people who suffer from chronic conditions, let's say asthma or COPD, or even COVID as a good example, that there is microbiome dysfunction, meaning there's imbalance and dysbiosis and decreased barrier integrity and a loss of these beneficial species. And so now we have the ability to create sort of precision products to better understand, well, what's the function of some of these bacteria and can they drive balance to these specific systems of the body. And there are more companies and biotech companies and more microbiologists out there that are discovering these unique strains. I mean, we have, going back to kind of your idea or your question around neuroinflammation, we have psychobiotics now.
wow.
Psychobiotics are probiotics that have specific benefits or exert specific benefits to our mental well-being, meaning they're targeted in precision to decreasing inflammation in the brain. Like that is, I think, to me, one of the greatest discoveries in the microbiome, and truly where we're headed is really, not just isolating and studying, but manufacturing these strains that are targeted to these
Yeah.
systems. And so it becomes part of not just a foundational support, but we can start to add these targeted supplements or these targeted probiotics or even postbiotics, which I think are super exciting, into these interventions to start to improve our health.
Yeah, I wanted to go a step further because, it's so funny yesterday. It's actually funny when I was reaching out to you to even like set up this amazing podcast scheduled. I even asked you like a bunch of questions about like a book I was reading. And so one thing I read yesterday, and it was I even have the book right here. Gut by Julia Enders. Julia Enders, she's got a lot of knowledge and she really dumbs it down for people like me who's trying to just understand my way here. And one thing she mentioned is even heart health, like cholesterol.
Yep.
There are certain
Yep.
bacterial strains like Lactobacillus reuteri.
Break that. And there's been some strains. And so that's one of the things that I think is really exciting about microbiome research is you can take a species like Lactobacillus reuteri, which has been studied for various things. But I always like to explain this idea of species and strain because we are better able to understand the unique. So, for people listening, think of like dogs, right? They're all part of the same canine species, but you've got West Highland Terriers and you've got Yorkshire Terriers. I use those because those are dogs that we've had. And Westies are very different than Yorkies. They look different. They sound different. They have different personalities. Or think of you and
Wow.
I,
Mhm.
right? We're all Homo sapiens, but we're super unique. We have our own DNA, we have our own makeup, and that's the same with our
Wow.
bacteria. So you can take, let's say, a Lactobacillus acidophilus, which everyone's heard about, is often in our yogurt. But when you take it to that strain level, right, that changes the function. So you can't extrapolate, say, research that's been done on L. reuteri to a specific L. reuteri
Okay.
strain or Lactobacillus acidophilus. And that's important because I think that actually helps break through some of the noise of even quality around supplements. That if you see a supplement brand that's just listing out that species, Lactobacillus acidophilus, Lactobacillus, reuteri, Bifidobacterium longum, and you're just kind of naming this, but you're not
Strain.
getting down to that strain, that
Yeah.
nomenclature of where you have those numbers and
Yeah.
letters, that you can't really say that they're doing the same thing. Back in the day, like earlier on in technology, we didn't have as advanced technology to be able to do that. And so I think that's something that a lot of people in this field are stressing is that we have beneficial bacteria, but then they have unique personalities when you can identify what their functions are.
Awesome, awesome. That's so so cool. And again, because I'm reading Gut by Julia Enders, there's another thing I wanted to share with you, and I wanted to hear your thoughts. So one thing that stood out to me was how she mentioned people in Asia, they have unique bacteria that let them digest seaweed better because it's part of their cultural diet. I was wondering how much do culture and the foods we grow up with shape our microbiome?
So there's some great research coming out of, some of the big microbiology labs, like Justin Sonnenberg's lab, that are looking at some of these unique enzymes that our bacteria have. Like it's same thing with lactose and lactase degrading bacteria that we lose that with industrialization, and I think it's something unique that as we start to hone in on some of these unique polysaccharides and enzymes and exopolysaccharides that have very unique qualities that I think where like the biotech and industrialization, or not industrialization, but the biotech and manufacturing world will go is, can we start to isolate some of these enzymes that make food more digestible? It's because we're potentially lacking them. And so I think it's an exciting area. We know that there are microbes that have gone extinct through industrialization, and I think doing the research, so like if we were to take some of these wild strains or some of these extinct microbes and give them to us, will our body adapt? Will we respond to that? Potentially. And I think that's where we have to do the research. And so I challenge, companies and microbiologists and researchers who are starting to isolate these, that if you're going to put a product out there, then you've got to do research on that final product to make sure that it's doing what we want. Because again, we also know that people respond and don't respond. And so, yeah, I think the polysaccharide, it's called something like porphyra. I forget the name of it, but that's been talked a lot about with the seaweed, that makes it, so that people digest culturally. And we know that through generations, that generationally we're losing microbes. So if like my grandmother didn't have a certain microbe, then there's a potential that I don't have that. So I think that's really unique, and that's why a lot of the microbiome science is being done on tribes and indigenous tribes because they have very different looking microbiomes than those of us living in this more sort of modern industrialized world.
Yeah, speaking of tribes and speaking of just things, of groups of people across seas, overseas, in Eastern traditions, like Ayurveda, we were mentioning a little bit about it before the call. There's this idea of digestive fire, right? Agni, Pitta, and the balance of heat and energy in the gut. Do you see any parallels between these concepts and what we know scientifically about gut function and metabolism?
Definitely, and I love I mean, so much of our sort of health and, traditions have been anecdotally passed down. I mean, we have so much traditional wisdom that's been used, and we didn't have necessarily the science, back in the day to do that, and I think that's what's exciting about the sort of research landscape. Unfortunately, when you look at some of the nutritional science or you look at some of the alternative, and complementary medicine, it lacks because I think there's not enough funding to do it. I mean, I used to always have some of the providers that I worked with saying, "Oh, nutrition's so fascinating, but the science is so bad." It's because no one's funding this because it goes against, some of the so we do have some great studies on plant compounds and plant medicines and Ayurvedic and alternative therapies, and I think this is where I really find kind of this new lens of research exciting because we've also changed what research means. We do more real evidence and real world evidence where it's not necessarily RCTs that carry a lot of value in understanding some of the traditional methodologies that have been used and take it from being just, say, anecdotal or what we've kind of known about some of these plant compounds and put it into more modern experiments. And I think that that's exciting. I mean, we've got great, someone said this to me the other day. I have an intern and she's like, oh, there's just not a lot of research on plant compounds or alternative medicine. And I said, actually, there is. The problem is it's just not as robust as the research that's available on other things because it's hard to fund that. It's very expensive to run research. But now there are opportunities and places and organizations that are set up to do this type of research, which is why I think that's, kind of the new lens of even the supplement space of quality. And how do you really determine quality? Well, if a company's putting out a supplement, they should be doing finished product research. So taking these sort of plant compounds and these things we've known for a long time that are beneficial for us and putting it into a capsule and doing the studies to show. I think that's really important. That's something we do, at Resbiotic is we use bioactive. We use herbs like Visaka and holy basil and some of these traditional Ayurvedic herbs, and we combine it with biotics. But we're doing the research to make sure that we're getting the efficacy that we want and that it's actually doing what we intend it to do and the quality is there. Because I think there's a lot of ancient wisdom that's been passed down that we know is beneficial and can be utilized as part of a whole person or whole body plan. And I think it's important for us to start to put the data behind it now.
Absolutely. And speaking of exciting things, around the microbiome research and nutrition. So this Agni and this Pitta and these different digestive fires, we did touch on it a bit. Do we have any clue if there's a correlation between different densities of these bacterial strain concentrations with different gut types?
Absolutely, and actually, there is a lot of research going on
Yeah.
around that if you have this so we don't really have defined yet in the microbiome realm of what a healthy microbiome is, meaning this abundance of this, we know that there are certain bacterial species and that are more predominant, that are your short chain fatty acid producing bacteria that we want more abundance of, but we don't have, like, this kind of distinct profile, and that is actually what's being really looked at now in the research. We know there are key characteristics to what creates a more resilient and healthy microbiome, which is diversity and diversity of these probiotic species. We know we want to have a strong mucosal barrier. We know we want to have, less of those lipopolysaccharides. And so we have these sort of key characteristics that are essential. And we can see some of that in microbiome testing, but we don't have this kind of like a healthy microbiome has this much of this and this much
Right.
of this and this. We don't have that
Yeah.
quite yet. And I don't know if we will. And so we definitely are better able to look at different microbial profiles and say, okay, this is a profile that is more predominant in someone who has Crohn's disease, let's say, or someone who has thyroid issues. And there are companies that are actually tracking and really able to kind of put more conditions behind microbial signatures, which is really cool. But I don't think we'll ever really be the, because again, you can't diagnose, but is this a way to potentially see changes in the microbiome before a condition even sets in? Potentially. And I think that's would be like a very exciting realm of microbiome research, is to say, okay, does your microbiome start to shift and change and you have more fusobacterium in your stool, which has been more connected to colon cancer? Well, can we catch that before something even takes place? I think that's, more to come. Yeah, I hope I'm alive, to see that. And that's this kind of precision landscape that we are headed down, from nutrition precision to microbiome precision. And I think this is what's going to start to shape more drug therapy. I mean, not to get into a whole nother
Yeah.
category, but even in the GLP-1 agonist world, there's been some pilot studies done to show, well, people who are on a GLP-1 agonist like Ozempic, your semaglutides, that why are some people responding and not responding? Well, the microbiome's actually been looked at, and they've found that there are certain types of bacteria that are more predominant in responders versus non-responders. I think we're just going to start to see this. We know that there are certain bacteria that are necessary to um, break down and biotransform certain medications. And so I think that we're just moving more into that direction of the microbiome being a key player in understanding not just health outcomes, but how we respond to certain things like food and medications and other therapies.
So cool. And I had a follow-up for you, because you were mentioning how, because of with this precision treatment and this microbiome precision therapeutics that we will be seeing in the near future. If you could design the ideal model of gut healthcare, what role would culture and food play in it?
I think it would play a huge role because even from cultural standpoint, diet is such a big part of it. And if you are trying to eat foods that aren't part of your culture or that just you flat out don't like, that's not sustainable, right? So I think culture is a big part, and I think we know that certain cultures, especially in some of the research being done on like blue zones, or if you go to cultures that have a lot more fermentable food, a lot more fermented foods into their diet, their microbiomes look differently. So I think culture has to be included in any type of intervention, because that's that's at our
Right.
core, right? Like if someone tells me that, you know, a food that, say, is very predominant in my culture, that I couldn't eat it, again, if it's, like, hurting me, like, let's say something like gluten and I have celiac disease, that's a
Right.
different conversation, but I think we have to make these recommendations and these interventions that are pertaining to our culture, because that's who we are at, our basic self. And so, we definitely are studying more cultural foods and its relationship on the microbiome, and that's been done a lot, across Japan and Asia, and indigenous tribes that have, say, more predominant starchy foods or fibrous foods, or have more fermented foods. And I think that's, we're getting a lot more insight. But what we don't have is like, how do we extrapolate that information and then bring it to our modern world? I think that's where sometimes there's a sort of a misstep, because even something like the Mediterranean diet, which is always deemed as, the sort of best diet, I don't think of it as like, oh, the same foods. What I extrapolate from that diet is balance, that we're choosing the best types of carbohydrates, the best types of proteins, the best types of
Right.
fats. But I mean, I live in Colorado. I'm in the middle of the country. I don't have access to like lots of fresh fish. Um, and so that's where, then supplements come into play. But what I love about that diet in particular is that we're not excluding any type of food group. And so I think that's where that next level of translation has to come in, where if we're looking at people in Japan who are eating lots of fermented foods, who eat smaller portions, then how do we take some of those ideas and concepts and bring it to our modern world, or bring it to your specific cultural ideas or your cultural choices? And that's something that I've worked with in nutrition a lot, is people coming from all sorts of, areas of the world, and really looking at, well, here are the foods that you eat in your diet, and here's how to choose the best versions of those foods.
Gotcha. So cool. And Kara, I had a cool question for you. If you had a magic wand, right, and you can fix anything about the gut healthcare system or just the healthcare system altogether, what would it be?
Oh my gosh. That is such a good question. I'll take it from like a larger sense of, our healthcare system. There's a lot of innate things that I think, are problematic. And I think the biggest thing is that we don't put an emphasis at all on preventative care and access to preventative care. I think there's a lot of tools out there, and unfortunately, I think insurance dictates a lot of this, and, lack of accessibility and affordability around some of this. But I would love to see more emphasis on preventative care. I think there's, a lot of conversation out there on our food system. And these are things that, we draw a lot of correlation from and not necessarily causation. But in terms of just even basic preventative care, lowering the age, like as they've done with, say, colonoscopies, but they're still expensive, and insurance is a big barrier. So I think that would be one thing that I'd love to see, if I had a magic wand, is just to make healthcare accessible. And just to give people the option of choosing to put their health first, right? We've got plenty of people who don't think about it, don't care, great, but we shouldn't be that I can't afford to go get that done, and it's something that could potentially save my life. And so, that's something I would love to see change.
I love it. And Carrie, my final question to you is finally, what message of hope would you like to share with someone listening who feels stuck in their gut healing journey and sees food more as an enemy than a friend?
That's a great question, because I think a lot of people feel that way, and I've worked with so many people. And I think the message is that there's a lot that we can do. I think it can become very doom and gloom, and, oh, I'm stuck like this. There's nothing out there that can help me. And even, I don't necessarily always say like, oh, food is medicine, but food can support your symptoms, meaning what you're not often eating is one of the biggest things that we can start to incorporate. I generally, always encourage people to work with someone who's familiar with this, because they can help you do this in a very safe and in a very really in a safe way that hopefully takes out the fear. But the beauty is that our food, with support from other things, from stress and sleep to, obviously some really great supplements out there, that you don't have to feel like this forever. We've gotten many people learn how to cope and learn how to remedy their symptoms, and understand how their own body reacts. Because I think it can be a very noisy place to go down, because we hear, oh, I shouldn't do this and I should do this and I need to
Right.
take this, and it's unique to you. And sometimes it could be as simple as changing the type of dairy you're eating. It could be as simple as just adding in more of those fibrous foods that your body tolerates. But it's important to work with someone who's knowledgeable in that area. But the bottom line is if you are someone who suffers from IBS and SIBO, you can feel better, and there are definite steps you can take to get there.
Amazing. Amazing. That was amazing advice and a very loving message. Kara, thank you so much for all your time today. I really do believe that medical professionals like you are really at that forefront of solving a lot of these gut issues for us and giving us kind of like a magnifying glass and showing us what can go wrong in our body, what are the root causes, and what's the ideal lifestyle and diet we want to imbibe in our life to ensure long-term health, long-term wellness. So thank you so, so much for all your time today.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. It was a great conversation.